Chapter 3. The dog-wanting disease never did leave me altogether. With the new work I was doing, helping Pa, it just kind of burned itself down and left a big old sore on my heart. Every time I'd seen a coon track down in our field or along the river banks, the old sore would get all festered up and go back to hurting again. It was just when I'd given up all hope of ever owning a good hound, something wonderful happened. The good Lord figured I'd heard enough, and it was time to lend a helping hand. It all started one day when I was hoeing corn down in our field near the river. Across the river, a party of fishermen had been camping for several days. I heard the old Maxwell car as it snorted and chugged its way out of the bottom, and I knew that they were leaving. Throwing down my hoe, I ran down to the river and waded across to a place that was called the Shannon Ford, and I hurried to the campground. It was always a pleasure to prowl where the fishermen had camped. I usually could find things, a fishing line or a forgotten fishing pole, and on one occasion I found a beautiful knife stuck in the bark of a sycamore tree, forgotten by a careless fisherman. But on that day, I found the greatest of treasure, a sportsman magazine discarded by the campers. It was a real treasure for a country boy, and because of that magazine, my entire life was changed. I sat down on an old sycamore log and started thumbing through the leaves, and on the back pages of that magazine, I came to the for sale section. Dogs for sale, of every kind of dog. I read on and on. They had dogs I'd never heard names of, names I couldn't make out, and far down in the right-hand corner, I found an ad that took my breath away. In small letters it read, "Registered red-bone coonhound pups, $25 each." The advertisement was from a kennel in Kentucky, and I read it over and over. By the time I had memorized the ad, I was seeing dogs and hearing dogs and even feeling them. The magazine was forgotten. I was lost in thought. The brain of an 11-year-old boy can dream some fantastic dreams. How wonderful it would be if I could have 2 of those pups. Every boy in the country but me had a good hound or 2, but $50. How would I ever get $50? I knew I couldn't expect help from Ma or Pa. I remembered a passage from the Bible my Ma used to read to us. God helps those who help themselves. And I thought of those words, and I mulled them over in my mind. I decided I'd ask God to help me. And there, on the banks of the Illinois River, in the cool shade of the tall white sycamores, I asked God to help me get 2 hound pups. It wasn't much of a prayer, but it did certainly come right from the heart. When I left the campground of the fishermen, it was late, and as I walked along I could feel the hard bulge of the magazine jammed deep in the front of my overalls. The beautiful silence that followed the setting sun was setting on the river bottoms. The coolness of the rich black soil felt good on my bare feet. It was the time of day when all furried things came to life. A big swamp rabbit hopped out on the trail, sat on his haunches and stared at me, and then scampered away. A mother gray squirrel ran out onto a limb of a bur oak tree. She barked a warning to the 4 fur balls behind her, and they melted from sight into the thick green. A silent gray shadow drifted down from the top of the tall sycamore, and there was a squeal and a beating of wings, and I heard the tinkle of a bell in the distance ahead. I knew it was Daisy, our milk cow. I'd have to start her on her way home. I took the magazine from my pocket, and again I read that ad. Slowly, a plan began to form. Well, I'd saved the money. I could sell stuff to the fishermen, crawfish, minnows, fresh vegetables. In berry season, I could sell all the berries I could pick at my grandfather's store, and I could trap in the winter. The more I planned, the more real it became. there was a way to get those pups. Saved my money. I could almost feel the pups in my hands, and I planned the little doghouse and where it'd be put, collars I could make myself, and then the thought came to me. What would I name them? Well, I tried name after name and voicing them out loud. None seemed to fit. Well, there'd be plenty of time for names. Right now, there was something more important. $50. A fabulous sum, a fortune, far more money than I'd ever seen before. Somehow, some way, I was determined to get it. I had 23 cents. A dime I'd earned running errands for my grandpa, and 13 cents a fisherman had given me for a can of worms. The next morning, I went to the trash pile behind the barn. I was looking for a can, my bank. Well, I picked up several, but they didn't seem to be quite what I wanted, and then I saw it. An old KC baking powder can. It was perfect, long and slender with a good tight lid. I took it down to the creek and scrubbed it with sand until it was bright and new looking. I dropped the 23 cents in the can. The coins looked so small laying there on the shiny bottom, but to me it was a good start. With my finger I tried to measure how full it'd be with $50 in it. Next I went to the barn, up in the loft. Far back over the hay and up under the eaves I hid my can. I had a start towards making my dreams come true. 23 cents. I had a good bank and was safe from the rats and from the rain and snow. All through that summer I worked like a beaver. In the small creeks that wormed its way through our fields, I caught crawfish with my bare hands. I trapped minnows with an old screen wire trap I'd made myself, baited with yellow cornbread from my mother's kitchen. These I sold to the fishermen, along with fresh vegetables and roasted ears. I tore my way through the blackberry patches until my hands and feet were scratched raw and red from the thorns. I tramped the hills seeking out the huckleberry brush, and Grandfather paid me 10 cents a bucket for my berries. Once Grandpa asked me what I did with the money I earned, and I told him that I was saving to buy some hunting dogs. I asked him if he would order them for me if I had saved enough, and he said he would. I asked him not to say anything to Father. He promised he wouldn't, and I'm sure Grandpa paid little attention to my plans. That winter I trapped harder than ever with those 3 little traps I own. Grandpa sold my hides to fur buyers who came to his store all through the fur season. Prices were cheap. 15 cents for a large opossum hide and 25 cents for a good skunk hide. Little by little, the nickels and dimes they added up, and the old KC bacon powder can it grew heavy. I would heft its weight in the palm of my hand, and with a straw, I'd measure from the lip of the can to the money. As the months went by, the straws they grew shorter and shorter. The next summer, I followed the same routine. Would you like to buy some crawfish or minnows? Maybe you'd like some fresh vegetables or roasting ears? The fishermen were wonderful, as true sportsmen are. They seemed to sense the urgency in my voice, and always they bought my wares. However, many was the time I'd find my vegetables left in the abandoned camp. There never was a set price. Anything they offered was good enough for me. Well, a year passed, and I was 12, and I was over the halfway mark. I had $27.46. My spirits soared. I worked all the harder. Another year crawled by, and then that great day came. The long, hard grind was over, and I had it. I had my $50. I cried as I counted it over and over. As I set the can back in the shadowy eaves of the barn, it seemed to glow with a radiance of whiteness I'd never seen before. Perhaps it was all imagination, I don't know. Laying back on that soft hay, I folded my hands behind my head and closed my eyes and let my mind wander back over those 2 long years. I thought of the fishermen, the blackberry patches, the huckleberry hills. I thought of the prayer that I had said when I asked God to help me get those 2 hound pups. And I know He had surely helped me, for He had given me the heart and the courage and the determination. Early the next morning, with that can jammed deep in the front pocket of my overalls, I flew over to the store. As I trotted along, I whistled and sang. I felt as big as the tallest mountain in those Ozarks. Arriving at my destination, I saw 2 wagons were tied up at the hitching rack, and I knew some farmers had gone into the store, so I waited until they left. As I walked in, I saw my grandfather behind the counter. Tugging and pulling, I worked the can out of my pocket and dumped it out in front of him and looked up. Grandpa was dumbfounded. He tried to say something, but it wouldn't come out. He looked at me finally, and he looked at that pile of coins, and finally, in a voice much louder than he ordinarily used, he asked, "Where'd you get all this?" "I told you, Grandpa. I was saving my money so I could buy 2 hound pups, and I did. You said you'd order them for me. Well, I got the money, and now I want you to order them." Grandpa stared at me over his glasses and then back at the money. "How long you been saving this?" he asked. "A long time, Grandpa." "How long?" "2 years," I answered. His mouth flew open, and in a loud voice he said, "2 years?" Well, I nodded my head. The way my grandfather stared at me made me uneasy. I was on needles and pins. Taking his eyes from me, he glanced back at the money again. He saw the faded yellow piece of paper sticking out from the coins. He worked it out, asking as he did, "What's this?" I told him it was the ad, telling where to order my dogs from. He turned it over and read it, and then glanced on the other side. I saw the astonishment leave his eyes and the friendly old grandfather come looking back. I felt much better. Dropping the paper down on the money, he turned and picked up the old turkey feather duster and started dusting where there was no dust. He kept glancing at me out of the corner of his eye as he walked slowly from one end of the store to the other, dusting here and there. And then he put the duster down and came from behind the counter and walked up to me. Laying a friendly, old, work-calloused hand on my head, he changed the conversation altogether and said, "Son, you need a haircut." I told him I didn't mind. I didn't like my hair being short with the flies and mosquitoes that bothered me. He glanced down at my bare feet and asked, "How come your feet are all cut and scratched like that?" And I told him it was pretty tough picking blackberries barefoot. And he nodded his head. It was too much for my grandfather. He turned and walked away. I saw the glasses come off and the old red handkerchief come out, and I heard the good excuse of blowing his nose. He stood for several seconds with his back towards me, and when he turned around, I noticed his eyes were kind of moist. In a quivering voice, he said, "Well, son, it's your money. You worked for it, and you worked hard. You got it honestly, and you want some dogs. By all things damned, you'll be getting them dogs." That was as near as I ever come to hearing my grandfather curse, if you could call it cursing. He walked over and picked up the ad again and asked, "Is this ad 2 years old too?" Well, I nodded. "Well, the first thing we have to do is write this outfit. There may not even be a place like this in Kentucky anymore. After all, a lot of things has happened in the last 2 years. Seeing that I was worried, he said, "Now you go on home. I'll write these kennels and I'll let you know when I get an answer. If we can't get the dogs here, we can think of some other place. And I don't think, if I were you, I'd let my pa know anything about this right away. I happen to know he wants to buy that red mule from old man Potter." I told him I wouldn't, and I turned to leave the store. As I reached the door, my grandfather said in a loud voice, "Say, it's kind of been a long time since you had any candy, hasn't it?" I nodded my head. He asked, "How long, you figure?" "Oh, probably a long time." Well, we'll have to do something about that. Walking over behind the counter, he reached out and got a sack, and I noticed it wasn't the nickel kind of sacks, it was one of the quarter kind. My eyes never left my grandfather's hand. Time after time, it dipped in and out of the candy counter, peppermint sticks, jawbreakers, horehound, gumdrops. The sack bulged, and so did my eyes. Handing the sack over to me, said, "Here, first big coon you catch with those dogs, you can pay me back." And I told him I would. And on my way home with a jawbreaker in one side of my mouth and a piece of horehound in the other, I skipped and whistled, making half an effort to try and whistle and sing, and couldn't do for the candy, though. I had the finest grandpa in the world, and I was the happiest boy in the world. I wanted to share my happiness with my sisters, but decided not to say anything about ordering the pups. Arriving home, I dumped the sack of candy out on the bed. 6 little hands helped themselves. I was well repaid by the love and adoration I saw in the wide blue eyes of my 3 little sisters. End of chapter 3.